Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Steinbreck, and I just kind of wanted to cover a few of the things that we talked about in class. We started talking about it in class last week. At the end, I introduced a new word called metacognition. A few had heard about it and a few hadn't, which is totally fine. It's a big word that really just means thinking about your own thinking and becoming a self-aware student. So these couple slides are going to talk about some of the things that we talked about in class as a reminder for those in-person class learners we have, and also to give a little preview for our virtual learners on some of the topics that we covered and some of the things to reinforce what you're doing for homework. So as I said, one of our goals in class was to define metacognition and list the traits of a self-aware student. Also to kind of think about poor metacognitive skills, and then part of your homework was to kind of evaluate your own skills. So let's bounce back here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what is metacognition. And we said it's being self-aware, kind of understanding how you think, what works best for you, those type of things. So there are about 5 traits that we're going to talk about just briefly about characteristics make a metacognitive student. The first one being you're able to focus on a task, one task at a time, actually, even though sometimes we think multitasking is a good thing. As a metacognitive student, you really want to be able to focus on the task at hand because it's hard to put your full effort into multiple things at once. The other thing a metacognitive student does is they identify learning goals. They're able to assess their environment, their learning environment, and make adjustments if it's not working for them. For instance, it might be when and where you study, whom you study with, how you study. A metacognitive student's able to realize if a study environment's not working for them, as well as controlling their thought processes. So they're able to adjust their thinking to work for them. They can also continually gauge how things are going and their progress they're making. So really they're just thinking about all aspects of learning, all aspects of learning. Part of your homework was to evaluate those 4 students in your social study skills book. You were really looking for those skills in those students. Are they able to focus on one task? Are they able to monitor and adjust their thinking? Are they able to see their progress towards a bigger goal? So those were things that you were working on. So let's review real quick a little bit about metacognition. So for instance, number 1, the words in the blank should say thinking about thinking is called metacognition. It's an important trait for a self-aware student. The metacognitive student does not multitask, which means trying to pay attention to other tasks while learning. They focus on a single task of learning. So number 3, a metacognitive student identifies their specific learning goals so that their brain knows what information to retrieve as they study. A metacognitive student monitors their learning environment and thinking processes and makes adjustment to optimize learning. And lastly, a metacognitive student gauges progress toward their learning goals by checking comprehension, self-testing, and putting concepts into their own words. A metacognitive student tests themselves before their teacher tests them. And it might look like a variety of different things, but it's something to keep in mind that when you're really thinking about what you're learning, it helps you process more deeply. These are things that you were working on when you were kind of checking out how those students were doing, if they were metacognitive or not. So are they focused on their task of learning? Have they been able to identify specific goals? Can they tell if their learning environment needs to be adjusted? So for instance, have they moved to their room instead of sitting in the busy dining room? Are they able to monitor their thinking? And are they able to gauge their progress? So do they check, kind of recheck their answers, that kind of thing. So here are those 5 traits that we kind of reviewed about being a metacognitive student. And the other thing in class we talked about were our posters that everyone will be sharing to Google Classroom. But metacognition basically just means that idea of being able to think about your thinking. All right. So the other aspect of our class this week was we reviewed a little bit about the brain. And if you remember in our executive functioning book, we talked about the brain as well. We're just revisiting lots of topics, so hear about them, and they'll probably come back up sometime throughout the semester, or if you're in the high school class throughout the year. Revisiting and relearning or making our learning deeper helps us to keep that knowledge. So it's some of that retention of knowledge, and then also being able to demonstrate our knowledge. So we all know that our brain does a lot for our body, but we really don't think about how much it controls. So think about how all the stuff you see, hear, smell, and feel every day, it works through your skill to become knowledge and a memory. So some of our goals for what we discussed in class were to be able to review those parts and label the parts of the brain involved in learning, understand the basic process by which the brain converts sensory data to knowledge, and then create a plan for maintaining a healthy brain. So we just have a few slides to go through. And we talked a little bit about this when we worked with our interactive brain, one of our first weeks of class, but we're going to review a little bit of this stuff real quickly, just as a quick refresher. We know that we learned that metacognition means thinking about thinking, and a metacognitive student is able to reflect on their learning, restate concepts, and self-test. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the brain, the organ that does all the thinking for them. So that's what we're really learning about. So have you ever thought that perhaps you take your brain for granted? Have you ever considered what an amazing organ the human brain is? So that's kind of our focus. So if you think about it, if you hold up your two fists, you face them inwards and touch them, that's about the size of their brain. The brain weighs about 3 pounds, but it works 24/7 nonstop around the clock. The brain processes information incredibly fast. It is very sophisticated. So knowing a little bit more about our brain and reviewing what we've already learned will help us. So there's the exterior brain. The brain has two halves. If you think about it, they're called hemispheres, and each hemisphere has 4 exterior lobes. So the frontal lobe, if you think about it, place both your hands on your forehead. The lobes at the front of the brain are called the frontal lobes. They are the largest lobes. And then behind that is the prefrontal cortex, which it helps you with your reasoning, problem solving, making decisions, and coordinating speech. So like if you're thinking of a math formula, or resisting the impulse to grab that donut out of your friend's hand, your frontal lobe is at work. People with sometimes if you have a prefrontal cortex injury, they might be impulsive. They might not be able to process all that. So for successful learning, it's really important that we protect that prefrontal cortex from injury. So after that frontal lobe is our temporal lobe. Put your hands above your ears and think about that. Can you hear me? So if you understand me, then your frontal or your temporal lobes are working. So temporal lobes process what you hear, like speech and music, and they also help form long-term memories. The next is the parietal lobe. Place your hand on top of your head, and they're involved in spatial orientation and sensory integration, okay? So it's helping you move your body where you want to go. Move your body where you want to go. And the last one is your occipital lobes. And these are, place your hands on the back of your head, and they are what help with your vision, okay? So as you process what you see, those are your occipital lobes. As we move into the interior brain, the limbic system is located within the interior brain and contains structures important to learning. So the hypothalamus, think about, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you sleepy? This structure constantly monitors internal symptoms like body temperature, hunger, and fatigue. It helps to keep everything in balance. Then we go to our hippocampus, which is your ground zero for learning, memory, and recall. It can take several exposures to the information before a memory is formed well enough to be recalled. On to the amygdala, which is responsible for your emotions, things like being fearful, happy, or sad. It also helps to imprint those emotional memories. And last but not least are your neurons, axons, dendrites, and synapses. So sensory information from the outside world is able to move into this limbic system along our nerve cells called neurons, and the brain is made up of billions of neurons. Each neuron has thousands of branch-like little extensions called dendrites and axons, and they're constantly receiving and transmitting electrical impulses to areas called synapses. Synapses enable neurons to communicate. So memory is stored in these synaptic connections. So the first time you learn something, it's new to your brain, and your brain kind of has to create these roadmaps to help you. So if you study it once, it might be hard to recall. And remember, we learned that that learning was a 3-step process. So it's, taking that information in, being able to recall it, and then also being able to demonstrate our learning. When you read, study, and review, your brain forms new synapses and strengthens old patterns. The more you study, the stronger these connections become, and it makes information easier to recall and to understand. So, which is kind of why we're learning about the brain again. We're trying to strengthen those connections to make it imprint in your mind. All right, so that's kind of the basic of what we learned this week. You'll be doing some of these things for homework, but we reviewed some of the parts of the brain. As always, feel free to reach out to questions, but think about how all this stuff kind of relates back to each other. We're going to keep learning new things, but we're also going to be revisiting old topics so that we really strengthen those paths in the brain and make it permanent memories.